So, let's go. Number 1. Noma. Its name comes from the Greek word nomen, which means to devour. That is not a metaphor. Noma is a disease that eats the human face. It begins as something small and easy to ignore, a little ulcer on the gum of a young child. Within days, that ulcer turns dark. The tissue around it begins to die. Over 1 or 2 weeks, the rot spreads outward through the cheek, the lip, and sometimes the jawbone itself, carving a hole in a living face. If nothing stops it, 80 to 90% of the children who develop it will die. This is not a new horror. Noma was described by Hippocrates and by Galen more than 2,000 years ago. A Dutch physician named Carolus Batus wrote a detailed clinical account of it in the 16th century. It has followed humanity through every age of medicine, and it is still here. Today it clusters in a region of sub-Saharan Africa that researchers call the Noma Belt, running roughly from Senegal in the west to Ethiopia in the east. For most of the modern era, Noma was ignored by global health. That changed on December 15th, 2023, when the World Health Organization finally added it to its official list of neglected tropical diseases. Estimates of how many children it strikes each year range wildly, from 30,000 up to 140,000, and that uncertainty tells you something. Noma kills so fast, in places so remote, that most of its victims are never counted at all. What is actually happening in the tissue? Noma is polymicrobial, meaning several organisms act together. Bacteria, including Fusobacterium necroform and Prevotella intermedia, appear to work in a deadly synergy, but they only get their chance when a child is already weakened. The real drivers are poverty, malnutrition, and infections like measles and malaria that flatten a young immune system. The peak of the disease falls on children between 2 and 6 years old, when their bodies are most vulnerable. Here's why modern medicine cannot simply cure it. If Noma is caught in its earliest stage, antibiotics can halt the spread. But once the tissue is dead, no drug brings it back. The only path is reconstructive surgery, a complex multi-stage process that is out of reach for almost every family living in the Noma Belt. Surgeons like the Dutch specialist Klaas Mark and charities such as Facing Africa work to rebuild these faces, but they are treating survivors, not curing the disease. There is a grim clue to Noma's nature in history. It appeared among the starving prisoners of Nazi concentration camps, at Belsen and Auschwitz, wherever human beings were reduced to hunger. That is why it is sometimes called the face of poverty. Noma is not waiting on a miracle molecule. It is waiting on the end of malnutrition, and researchers in Geneva and beyond are only now studying why some children fall to it and others do not. In older European medicine, it was sometimes called water canker, a name that hints at the way it seems to flow across the face. Charities such as Hilfsaktion Noma run reconstructive programs in Ethiopia and Nigeria, but they are fighting a rearguard action, repairing damage that never had to happen. The deepest tragedy of Noma is that almost everything needed to stop it already exists. Adequate food, basic oral hygiene, and prompt antibiotics in the first days would save nearly every child. What is missing is not a cure, it is access. Number 2, Balamuthia Mandrillaris. Most people have heard of the brain-eating amoeba. What most people do not know is that there are 2 of them, and the famous one is not the worst. The organism you may have read about is Naegleria fowleri, which kills in a matter of days. This one is different. This one is slower, quieter, and very nearly impossible to survive. Balamuthia Mandrillaris was discovered in 1986, and its origin story is strange. It was first found in the brain of a dead mandrill, a baboon that had died at the San Diego Wild Animal Park. Scientists led by Govinda Visvesvara at the Centers for Disease Control formally described it as a brand new genus and species in 1993. It causes a condition called Balamuthia amoebic encephalitis, a granulomatous rotting of the brain. Unlike Naegleria, which lives in warm fresh water, Balamuthia lives in soil, and it is found around the world. Infection is thought to begin when the amoeba enters through a break in the skin or is inhaled in dust, after which it travels, over weeks or even months, to the brain. That long, silent incubation is part of what makes it so lethal. By the time anything is obviously wrong, the amoeba is already deep inside the central nervous system. The numbers are stark. Fewer than about 200 cases have ever been reported worldwide, but more than 90% of them end in death. Only a handful of people are known to have survived. The disease disproportionately strikes the immunocompromised, the very young, the very old, and, for reasons still not understood, people of Hispanic descent. In Peru, many cases begin as a single, stubborn skin lesion in the center of the face, months before the brain is touched. There is no standardized cure. The few survivors were treated with desperate cocktails of drugs, including miltefosine, various antifungal azoles, pentamidine, flucytosine, and sulfadiazine. Miltefosine, a compound originally developed to fight cancer and later leishmaniasis, is the closest thing medicine has to a weapon, and the CDC keeps an emergency hotline to distribute it. But the amoeba can turn itself into a cyst, a hardened, dormant form that resists both drugs and the immune system. Balamuthia has another terrible trick. It is spread through organ transplantation, passing from an infected donor into several recipients at once and killing them. Diagnosis is so difficult that the infection is often only confirmed at autopsy. And because this is a free-living organism, a protist that has existed independently in soil for hundreds of millions of years, long before humans walked the earth, it cannot be eradicated. It does not need us. It simply waits in the ground, and on the rare, unlucky occasions it finds a way in, medicine can do almost nothing. Researchers such as Naveed Khan at Aga Khan University have spent years studying how the amoeba resists drugs and how its cyst form defends it. But progress is painfully slow against an organism this rare and this lethal. Doctors who do recognize it in time often reach for that same difficult cocktail of drugs and simply hope. The cruel irony is that Balamuthia is almost never the first thing anyone suspects. A vague skin lesion, a headache, a change in personality, none of it screams brain-eating amoeba until it is far too late. Number 3. Mycetoma. Imagine a disease that begins with a thorn prick and, over years, swells a human foot into a grotesque, misshapen mass riddled with weeping channels. This is Mycetoma, better known by its old colonial name, Madura foot. It was first described in 1842 in the Madurai region of southern India, but the organisms that cause it are far older than any human record. Mycetoma comes in two forms that look almost identical, but behave very differently. One is Eumycetoma, caused by fungi. The other is Actinomycetoma, caused by bacteria. Both produce the same eerie triad: a painless swelling, tracts that tunnel to the skin surface, and a discharge of tiny colored grains. Those grains are colonies of the organism itself, and their color, black, white, yellow, or red, is a clue to which species is at work. The black-grained fungus Magirella mycetomatis is one of the most common culprits. The World Health Organization recognized mycetoma as a neglected tropical disease in 2016. It clusters in a band between roughly 15 degrees south and 30 degrees north, taking in Sudan, Mexico, India, Senegal, and Somalia. Sudan is considered the global epicenter, and the Mycetoma Research Center in Khartoum, led by the surgeon Ahmed Fahal, is the world's reference point for the disease. It almost always begins in the barefoot poor, farmers and herders who pick up the organism through a small skin injury, like a thorn scratch. From there, it works inward, slowly, over months and years, until it reaches and destroys bone. And this is where medicine hits a wall. For the fungal form, cure rates are dismal, often below 35%. The standard treatment is the antifungal itraconazole, taken for a year or more. And even then, the operation that so often follows, amputation, is frequently the real endpoint. The bacterial form is a little kinder. Actinomycetoma responds better to a combination of the antibiotics amikacin and cotrimoxazole. But the fungal grains are the problem. They wall themselves into the tissue, hiding from drugs, so that even after surgery, the disease frequently returns. A clinical trial known as the DAC trial has tested a newer drug, fosravuconazole, hoping for something more tolerable and more effective than the old regimen. Because the fungi and bacteria that cause mycetoma live in the soil and predate agriculture itself, this is not a disease that can be wiped out. It is a slow, mutilating, stigmatizing illness that strips people of their ability to work and walk. And it remains one of the most frustrating infections in all of medicine, precisely because we still cannot reliably cure it. Diagnosis itself is a challenge. Doctors examine the grains under a microscope, culture the organism, and increasingly use ultrasound to map how deep the infection has burrowed, and molecular PCR testing to identify the exact species. Getting that species right matters enormously, because a fungal mycetoma and a bacterial one demand completely different treatment, and mistaking one for the other wastes the months the patient does not have. Even after apparently successful surgery, hidden grains left behind in the tissue can seed a fresh eruption, so that a patient thought to be cured finds the swelling creeping back. Number 4. Mucormycosis. There is a mold in your kitchen right now. It grows on old bread, on rotting fruit, in compost and garden soil. It belongs to an ancient group of fungi called the Mucormycosis, and for almost everyone, almost all of the time, it is completely harmless. You inhale its spores constantly and never know. But when the body's defenses collapse, this ordinary mold becomes one of the most terrifying infections known to medicine. Its nickname is the black fungus. The name does not come from the color of the mold. It comes from the color of what it leaves behind: black, dead, necrotic tissue. Mucormycosis is angioinvasive, meaning it invades blood vessels. It clots them off, cutting the blood supply and killing the tissue downstream. In its most feared form, the rhino-orbital cerebral form, it starts in the sinuses, spreads into the eye socket, and drives into the brain, sometimes within a matter of days. Overall mortality runs from 40 to 80%, and it climbs higher once the fungus reaches the brain. Who is vulnerable? The great risk factor is uncontrolled diabetes, especially a dangerous state called ketoacidosis. Others include immunosuppression, high-dose corticosteroids, and iron overload. The chief mold, Rhizopus, actually feeds on free iron and glucose, which explains why diabetic patients are such fertile ground. The world saw this with horrifying clarity in 2021, when India was struck by a wave of mucormycosis during the second wave of the COVID pandemic. Tens of thousands of cases erupted in patients whose diabetes and steroid treatment had opened the door. Treatment is brutal in every sense. It demands aggressive surgical debridement, the physical cutting away of infected flesh, often taking eyes, palates, and parts of the face with it. Alongside the knife comes intravenous liposomal amphotericin B, a powerful and toxic antifungal, with isavuconazole or posaconazole as follow-up drugs. There is a cruel twist here as well. A drug called deferoxamine, an iron chelator, actually makes mucormycosis worse, because the fungus hijacks the iron it delivers. Even with everything modern medicine can throw at it, survival often means disfigurement, and a single day's delay in diagnosis can be the difference between life and death. The Mucormycosis are intrinsically resistant to many common antifungals, including voriconazole, so the usual tools simply do not work. First described in the medical literature by Peltoff in 1885, this is an ancient mold that modern medicine has, in a sense, unleashed on itself by creating ever larger populations of diabetic and immunosuppressed patients for it to exploit. The sinus and brain form is the most feared, but it is not the only one. A cutaneous form can follow severe burns, trauma, or even contaminated bandages and surgical dressings, letting the mold enter directly through broken skin. And the global incidence is climbing, tracking the worldwide rise in diabetes and the expanding numbers of people on immune-suppressing treatments for cancer and transplants. Everyone breathes these spores every day and remains perfectly healthy. Mucormycosis is a stark reminder that the line between a harmless mold and a face-destroying infection is drawn entirely by the strength of the body's own defenses. Number 5. Trichinellosis. This one has been with us since before civilization, since the first time a human being ate a piece of undercooked meat from a wild animal. It is caused by a roundworm called Trichinella spiralis, and its life cycle is the stuff of nightmares, because the parasite ends up hidden alive inside your own muscle, in a place where no drug can reliably reach it. It starts with a meal. Historically, the culprit was pork, but bear, walrus, and horse meat have all carried it. The meat contains tiny larvae, coiled and encysted in the animal's muscle. You swallow them. In your gut, they mature into adult worms. The females then release a new generation of larvae, and these larvae do something extraordinary and horrifying. They migrate out of the intestine, into the bloodstream, and burrow into your striated muscle, favoring the diaphragm, the tongue, the jaw, and the muscles that move your eyes. Once inside a muscle cell, each larva transforms that cell into what biologists call a nurse cell, a living capsule that shelters and feeds the parasite. There it can survive for years, even decades, slowly calcifying over time. The parasite was first observed by a medical student named James Paget in 1835 and described that same year by the anatomist Richard Owen. The symptoms follow the invasion. First comes diarrhea, as the adults set up in the gut. Then, as the larvae spread, fever, a distinctive puffy swelling around the eyes, and deep muscle pain. In heavy infections, the parasite can reach the heart and the brain, causing myocarditis and encephalitis that can kill weeks after the original meal. Doctors use corticosteroids to try to calm the violent allergic reaction to all those migrating larvae. Here is the wall. Drugs like albendazole and mebendazole can kill the adult worms in the intestine, but they penetrate the encysted muscle larvae very poorly. Once the parasite has walled itself inside your muscle cells, no treatment reliably clears it. This is why trichinellosis is a disease you prevent by cooking meat and cannot truly cure once it has taken hold. There is a chilling Arctic footnote. A strain called Trichinella nativa is freeze-resistant, surviving in frozen bear and walrus meat, and Arctic hunters and explorers have died after eating infected polar bear. Some scholars have even argued that ancient taboos against eating pork may trace back to the dangers of this parasite, though that link remains debated. What is not debated is that Trichinella is one of the oldest human parasites of all, threaded into our diet since prehistory, and impossible to eradicate from the wild animals that carry it. In the developed world, the parasite has been pushed back dramatically. Regulation of the pork industry, formal surveillance programs in the United States dating back to 1938, and simple public guidance on thoroughly cooking pork drove infections down to a trickle. But it never disappeared, because it was never really about pork. Wherever people eat wild game, bear, boar, or Arctic sea mammals, that has not been inspected or properly cooked, trichinellosis can return in an instant. The worm outlasts every regulation because its true home is the vast, unmanaged world of wild carnivores. Number 6. Rift Valley Fever. Some diseases wait for the rain. Rift Valley Fever is one of them. It is caused by a virus, the Rift Valley Fever virus, first isolated in 1931 during an outbreak among sheep near Lake Naivasha in Kenya's Great Rift Valley. For most of its existence, it has been a disease of livestock, and when it strikes a herd, the result is devastating, a wave of miscarriages and dead newborn animals that veterinarians grimly call an abortion storm. The virus reaches humans in two ways: through the bite of Aedes and Culex mosquitoes, and through direct contact with the blood and tissue of infected animals. What makes it erupt is water. After heavy rains and flooding, vast clouds of mosquitoes hatch, and the virus explodes into the human population. Most people who catch it suffer only a mild flu-like illness, but in a small fraction, around 1 to 2%, the disease turns savage. Those severe cases take three terrible forms. There is a hemorrhagic form, in which the patient bleeds internally, with a fatality rate that can reach 50%. There is an encephalitic form, which attacks the brain. And there is retinitis, inflammation of the retina, which can leave survivors with permanent loss of central vision. For all three, there is no approved antiviral drug. Doctors can only provide supportive care and hope. There is also no licensed human vaccine. History shows how far it can travel. In 1977 and 78, a major outbreak swept Egypt, causing an estimated 18,000 or more cases and around 600 deaths, carrying the disease well beyond its sub-Saharan home. Then, in the year 2000, Rift Valley fever appeared in Saudi Arabia and Yemen, the first time it had ever been documented outside Africa, and a warning that it could spread further still. The virus has a built-in reservoir that makes it nearly impossible to stamp out. The eggs of Aedes mosquitoes can survive for years in dry soil, and they can hatch already carrying the virus, a process called transovarial transmission. So the moment the floods return, the disease is ready to return with them. The World Health Organization lists Rift Valley fever as a priority disease for epidemic preparedness, and climate change, along with expanded irrigation, is steadily widening the range of territory in which it can thrive. Diagnosis relies on laboratory tools, PCR to detect the virus directly, and ELISA tests to find the antibodies the body makes against it. Because it devastates livestock so completely, Rift Valley fever is also feared as a potential agent of agricultural bioterrorism, a virus that could cripple a nation's herds and food supply. For the individual patient bleeding, losing their sight, or slipping into a coma, none of that context helps. There's still no drug that targets the virus, only a hospital bed and time. Number 7. Lassa Fever. In 1969, in the town of Lassa in Borno State, Nigeria, 2 American missionary nurses fell ill and died from a mysterious hemorrhagic fever. The virus that killed them was entirely new to science, and it would nearly claim the life of the virologist Jordi Casals, who first studied it in the laboratory. That virus is now known as Lassa virus, an old world arenavirus, and although it was only identified in 1969, it has almost certainly been circulating in West Africa for thousands of years. The key to Lassa fever is a rodent. The natural reservoir is the multi-mammaty rat, Mastomus natalensis, one of the most common rats in Africa, a creature that lives comfortably alongside people. Humans catch the virus through contact with the rat's urine and droppings, which contaminate food and household surfaces, and sometimes by catching and eating the rats themselves. Because the reservoir is so widespread and so intimately tied to human dwellings, the disease is a permanent fixture of the region. The scale is enormous. Across West Africa, chiefly Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea, there are an estimated 100,000 to 300,000 infections every year, and around 5,000 deaths. About 80% of infections are mild or completely without symptoms. But when Lassa turns severe, it causes hemorrhage and multi-organ failure, and it leaves a signature behind. Roughly 1/3 of survivors suffer permanent sensorineural deafness, a hearing loss that can strike regardless of how mild or severe the illness seemed. Treatment is desperately limited. The antiviral ribavirin can help, but only if it is given very early in the course of the disease, and there is no fully reliable cure and no licensed vaccine. Lassa is especially deadly in pregnancy, with very high rates of maternal and fetal death in the 3rd trimester. It has also caused lethal clusters inside hospitals, killing the health workers who care for the sick. Nigeria now endures large seasonal outbreaks, particularly since 2018, and the virus is genetically diverse, with multiple lineages that complicate any attempt to build a vaccine. Cases have even been exported by travelers to the United States, the United Kingdom, and Europe. Organizations like CEPI are funding the search for a vaccine, but for now, with the rat reservoir woven into daily life across the region, elimination is simply not realistic, and treatment remains a narrow, uncertain window. The virus is so dangerous to handle that laboratory work on it requires the highest level of biological containment, known as BSL-4, the same category reserved for Ebola and Marburg. That alone tells you how seriously the scientific world takes it. Yet for the farmer or the market trader who catches it from a rat in their own home, that fearsome laboratory reputation means little. What they face is a fever that most of the time passes, and a small, unpredictable chance that it will turn into something that bleeds, kills, or leaves them permanently deaf. Number 8. Q fever. The name itself is an admission of ignorance. When an Australian doctor named Edward Holbrook Derrick investigated a strange fever among slaughterhouse workers in Queensland in 1935, he had no idea what caused it, so he called it Q fever, the Q standing for query. The culprit turned out to be a remarkable bacterium, Coxiella burnetii, identified through the work of Frank McFarlane Burnett and Mavis Freeman in Australia and Harold Cox in the United States, whose names live on in the organism. Coxiella is an obligate intracellular bacterium, meaning it lives inside the cells of its host, and it is astonishingly tough. It forms a spore-like variant that can survive heat, drying, and disinfectants for years. It is also one of the most infectious organisms known. A single inhaled bacterium can be enough to cause disease. Its reservoirs are farm animals, cattle, sheep, and goats, and it concentrates in staggering numbers in the products of birth, the placenta and amniotic fluid. From there, it dries into dust and rides the wind, sometimes infecting people miles from the nearest farm. Acute Q fever announces itself with fever, a pounding headache, pneumonia, or hepatitis, though many infections cause no symptoms at all. The real danger comes later. Months or even years after the first exposure, some people develop chronic Q fever, which most often takes the form of endocarditis, an infection of the heart valves, or infection of the blood vessels, and this is where medicine struggles most. Chronic Q fever can demand 18 months to several years of treatment with doxycycline combined with hydroxychloroquine, and even then it may never be fully cleared from the valves and grafts it colonizes. The largest recorded outbreak struck the Netherlands between 2007 and 2010, when more than 4,000 human cases were traced to dairy goat farms. Because of its stability and its tiny infectious dose, Coxiella burnetii is classified by the CDC as a Category B bioterrorism agent, and it was studied in past offensive biological weapons programs. Contaminated farm dust can stay infectious across entire seasons. Doctors distinguish acute from chronic infection using what are called Phase 1 and Phase 2 antibody tests. A whole cell vaccine called QVax exists in Australia for at-risk workers, but it is not widely available elsewhere. Ancient in the ecology of domesticated herds, hidden inside cells, and armored in a spore-like shell, Coxiella is a bacterium that antibiotics can suppress but often cannot truly defeat. Q fever is often called a neglected zoonosis, a disease passed from animals to people that slips under the radar. Its symptoms are so vague and varied that it is frequently misdiagnosed, mistaken for an ordinary flu, a run-of-the-mill pneumonia, or a liver complaint. That means many acute cases are never identified at all, and the danger only becomes clear years later, when a heart valve begins to fail. For a patient with chronic Q fever endocarditis, the prospect of swallowing antibiotics every day for years, never quite certain the infection is gone, is its own kind of ordeal. Number 9. Coccidioidomycosis. In the dry soils of the American deserts lives a fungus with a patient, deadly strategy. It is called Coccidioides, in 2 species, Emitis and Posidacea, and the disease it causes is known to most people as valley fever. It was first described in 1892 in Argentina by a medical intern named Alejandro Posadas, studying a patient named Domingo Escura. Today, it is most associated with California's San Joaquin Valley, Arizona, and parts of Mexico and South America. The fungus has a double life. In the soil it grows as a mold, producing microscopic spores called arthroconidia. When the ground is disturbed by wind, by construction, by an earthquake, those spores lift into the air and people breathe them in. There is no person-to-person spread. Every case comes from the dust. Once inside the warm human body, the fungus transforms into a completely different structure, a spherule, in a shape-shifting process called dimorphism. For most people, this is not a catastrophe. Around 60% of infections produce no symptoms at all, and most of the rest resemble a stubborn pneumonia, sometimes nicknamed desert rheumatism. But in roughly 1% of cases, the fungus disseminates, spreading beyond the lungs to the skin, the bones, the joints, and most dangerously, the meninges, the lining of the brain. Coccidioidal meningitis is uniformly fatal if untreated, and controlling it requires antifungal therapy for the rest of the patient's life. The mainstay drug is fluconazole, but here is the cruelty of it. In disseminated and meningeal disease, stopping treatment almost always allows the infection to come roaring back. For the most stubborn cases, doctors turn to amphotericin B, sometimes injecting it directly into the spinal fluid. Certain groups face far higher risk of the disease spreading, including people of African and Filipino descent, pregnant women, and the immunocompromised. Cases in the United States have climbed sharply, now exceeding 20,000 reported each year, concentrated in Arizona and California. Dust storms and soil disturbance drive the spikes. A famous California dust storm in 1977 carried the fungus far outside its usual range and caused an outbreak. The fungus can also lie dormant in the body and reactivate years later if the immune system weakens. There is no vaccine, though research continues. And because Coccidioides is an ancient environmental organism of the deserts, it can never be eradicated. Valley fever is a disease medicine can suppress for a lifetime, but rarely, if ever, truly cure. Doctors track the infection using blood tests, called complement fixation titers, which measure the body's antibody response, and help judge whether the disease is spreading or being held in check. Those numbers can guide treatment, but they cannot end it, because for the sickest patients, there is no true endpoint. As the deserts of the American West grow hotter and drier, and as more people move into and build across endemic land, the fungus is meeting more human lungs than ever before. Valley fever is a disease of the soil itself, and the soil is not going anywhere. Number 10. Tetanus. You already know this one, or you think you do. Tetanus is the disease of the rusty nail, the reason you were told to keep your shots up to date. But behind that familiar warning is one of the oldest and most unyielding diseases in human history, one that we can prevent completely, and yet, once it takes hold, still cannot treat away. Hippocrates described its terrible lockjaw more than 2,400 years ago. Tetanus is caused by an anaerobic soil bacterium, Clostridium tetani, and more precisely by the neurotoxin it produces, called tetanospasmin. The bacterium's spores are everywhere, in soil, in dust, in animal feces, and they can survive for years. They enter the body through wounds, classically the deep puncture of a nail, where the low oxygen environment lets them germinate. Then the toxin they make begins its journey, traveling up the nerves to the spinal cord. There it does something diabolical. Tetanospasmin blocks the inhibitory neurotransmitters, GABA and glycine, that normally tell muscles to relax. Without those breaks, the muscles contract uncontrollably. The result is the classic picture of tetanus. Lockjaw, the fixed and ghastly grin called risus sardonicus, and the full body arching known as opisthotonus, in which the back muscles clench so hard the body bends like a bow. And here is the wall that modern medicine still cannot climb. Once the toxin has bound to a nerve ending, no drug can pull it off. Antitoxin, given as tetanus immune globulin, can neutralize only the toxin that is still free in the blood, not what is already locked onto the nerves. So treatment becomes purely supportive. Doctors sedate the patient, give muscle relaxants, put them on a ventilator, and wait for weeks while the body slowly grows new nerve terminals to replace the poisoned ones. Even with the full power of a modern intensive care unit, 10 to 20% of patients still die, many from the wild swings in blood pressure and heart rate that the disease causes. The science that tamed it is a story of giants. Kitasato Shibasaburo isolated the bacterium in pure culture in 1889. The next year, working with Emil von Behring, he developed antitoxin serum therapy, and von Behring would win the very first Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1901. In the 1920s, Gaston Ramon and Pierre Descombes created the toxoid vaccine that made tetanus preventable. Yet the disease has not vanished. Neonatal tetanus, from cutting the umbilical cord with unsterile tools, still kills tens of thousands of newborns every year. Because its spores live permanently in the soil, tetanus can never be eradicated. It is the ultimate proof of a hard truth, that for some of the oldest sicknesses, we can prevent, but we cannot cure. Tetanus does not always take its full body form. There is a localized version, confined to the muscles near the wound, and a rare cephalic version that strikes the muscles of the head after a facial injury. But the most common and most dangerous is the generalized disease that seizes the whole body. Even for those who survive the weeks of spasms, recovery is slow, often 4 to 6 weeks of intensive care, and the wild swings of the autonomic nervous system, the racing and plunging heart rate and blood pressure, can prove as deadly as the muscle contractions themselves. It is a disease we understood and learned to prevent more than a century ago, and it still asks us, once it arrives, to do little more than keep the patient alive and wait. Look across these 10 diseases, and a pattern begins to emerge. A set of reasons why the full arsenal of modern medicine still falls short. The first is hiding. Several of these organisms live inside our own cells, where drugs and the immune system struggle to follow. Coxiella burnettii shelters within cells. The spherules of Coccidioides sit inside body tissue. Trichinella takes this to an extreme, converting a muscle cell into a nurse cell that protects it for decades. The second reason is encystment. Both Balamuthia and Trichinella can wrap themselves in hardened, dormant forms that shrug off both drugs and immune attack. The third is toxin. Tetanus does its damage not through the bacterium spreading, but through a poison that binds irreversibly to nerves, so that killing the organism does nothing to reverse the harm already done. The fourth is the destruction of the very tissue that would deliver a cure. Mucormycosis clots off blood vessels and kills the flesh around it, cutting off the blood supply that any drug would need to reach the fungus. Then there is sequestration. The way Mycetoma's fungal grains wall themselves into tissue, out of reach. And for the viral killers, Rift Valley fever and Lassa, there is simply no specific antiviral at all, leaving doctors with nothing but supportive care. Add to these the problem of late diagnosis, which haunts Noma and Balamuthia alike, the difficulty of getting drugs into muscle, brain, and heart valves, and the intrinsic resistance of molds like the Mucormycosis, and the picture is complete. These are not ordinary infections that stay conveniently in the bloodstream. They find refuge, they resist, and many of them move faster than we can respond. There is a deeper reason these diseases will never be defeated the way smallpox was, and it comes down to where they live. Smallpox could be eradicated because it needed human beings to survive. It had nowhere else to go, so when we vaccinated the last chains of transmission, it vanished. Not one of the sicknesses on this list works that way. Many of them live independently in the environment, entirely apart from us. Balamuthia, Coccidioides, the tetanus bacterium, and the molds of mucormycosis are all creatures of the soil and the dust. They do not need a human host to persist. They simply exist in the ground, waiting. Others live in a permanent web of animal reservoirs. Trichinellus cycles through wild carnivores. Lassa lives in the multi-mommet rat. Rift Valley fever hides in mosquitoes and livestock. Q fever cycles through cattle, sheep, and goats. Their survival tools are ancient and formidable. Spores and cysts act as capsules that can wait out years of hostile conditions. The eggs of the Rift Valley fever mosquito bank the virus in dry soil until the next flood hatches them. Rodents and ruminants keep Lassa and Q fever circulating no matter what we do. You can vaccinate people, you can cook your meat, you can control the dust, but the source never leaves. This is the crucial distinction between eradication and control. And it is exactly why the prehistoric origin of these diseases matters so much. They were here before our civilizations, and they will outlast them. If there is a single lesson running through all 10 of these diseases, it is that our real defense has never been the cure. It has been prevention. Tetanus makes the point with brutal clarity. A simple vaccine prevents it completely, yet nothing on earth cures the disease once the toxin has bound. Noma can be stopped by good nutrition and early antibiotics, but a face already destroyed cannot be restored by any drug. Trichinellosis is defeated in the kitchen by cooking and freezing meat, because the encysted larvae in muscle are permanent. The same holds for the viral and bacterial killers. With Q fever, Rift Valley fever, and Lassa, the true protection lies in controlling exposure, avoiding the dust, the mosquitoes, the rats, rather than in any reliable treatment. And this reframes something important about global health. The vast gap in who suffers and dies from these diseases, falling so heavily on the poor and the remote, is not really a gap in cures. It is a gap in prevention, in nutrition, in clean birth practices, in safe food, in vaccination. That is why the proudest advances against these ancient sicknesses tend to be preventive rather than curative. The frontier of hope is in vaccine research, against Lassa, against Rift Valley fever, against Coccidioides. It is a humbling thing to admit, in an age of extraordinary medical technology, that against some of the oldest organisms on the planet, our best move is still to avoid them entirely. None of this means medicine has surrendered. On several fronts, researchers are pushing hard against these diseases, and there are reasons for cautious optimism. The drug miltefosine, repurposed from cancer and leishmaniasis treatment, has given the first real, if fragile, hope against Balamuthia, and the CDC now keeps it stockpiled for emergencies. The DAC trial's work on phosravuconazole aims to give Mycetoma patients a better and more tolerable option than the old year-long courses of itraconazole. Vaccine science is where the biggest battles are being fought. Organizations like CEPI are funding candidate vaccines against both Lassa Fever and Rift Valley Fever, two of the priority pathogens on the World Health Organization's watch list. Research into a coccidioids vaccine, both for dogs and for humans, continues in the endemic states. and the WHO's decisions to formally recognize Mycetoma in 2016 and Noma in 2023 are quietly powerful, because that recognition unlocks funding and attention that these neglected diseases have gone without for generations. Faster molecular diagnostics using PCR are helping doctors detect these infections earlier when there is still a chance to act. But the ecology is shifting under our feet. Climate change is expanding the range of valley fever northward, already reaching into Washington state, and is widening the territory where Rift Valley fever and various fungi can flourish. The global surge in diabetes is enlarging the very population that mucormycosis preys upon. So there is a race underway between the new tools we are building and the changing world that is handing these ancient organisms new ground. Optimism is warranted, but it has to be balanced against that hard environmental reality. Step back far enough, and the most striking thing about these 10 diseases is their age. The organisms behind them are older than agriculture, older than the first cities, older than writing itself. Balamuthia was creeping through soil hundreds of millions of years before the first human. Tetanus spores, the fungi of the deserts, the parasites of wild meat, all of them shared the world with our earliest ancestors and never once left our side. That is the humbling truth at the center of this story. Modern medicine has conquered so much. It has driven smallpox to extinction, pushed polio to the brink, turned once fatal infections into minor inconveniences. And yet, against these particular sicknesses, it still runs into a wall. Not because we are careless, but because these organisms hide, resist, and outlast us, armored by hundreds of millions of years of evolution. The line between what we can prevent and what we can cure runs right through this list. It is worth remembering who bears the weight of that line. The victims of Noma, of Mycetoma, of Lassa Fever are disproportionately the poor and the remote, the people furthest from clean food, safe birth, and reliable vaccination. Real progress is being made in repurposed drugs and new vaccines and long overdue recognition. But it is incomplete. Against the oldest sicknesses on Earth, survival has almost always meant avoidance rather than victory, and understanding them, knowing how they work and why they endure, is the first and most important step toward finally changing that.